We have been through 2 or 3 of the most extraordinary weeks I think we'll ever witness in British politics. But I suspect that this is going to get even worse before it gets better. One of the reasons is that John Bercow is sitting as Speaker in the House of Commons. Oh, I've got better than that for you, don't you worry. And we've got whole rafts of MPs from all parties now breaking every single promise they've made, doing their best to try to overturn the Brexit result. Do you remember all of them told us that they would implement the result of the referendum? All of them told us in their manifestos that they would respect the result of the referendum and implement Brexit. And when I hear from a group of people, some on the hard left, others just hard Remain, who have, in the course of the last 10 to 15 years, particularly in this county, as I've campaigned, stood in elections, and when I've seen their abuse, when I've seen their trolling, when I've seen their intimidation, when I've seen their physical violence, now have the temerity to tell us that we shouldn't use words like surrender and betray. Boris Johnson is a big improvement on Theresa May. Let's be frank. Let's be frank. He's brought some energy and optimism to the job. His technology training is second to none. For those that got it, that's great. But for all the fine words, for all the talk, for all the mimicking of everything we've done since the 12th of April, it's all very well talking the talk, but can you actually walk the walk? And he is now, and I saw disturbing signs in Strasbourg last week. There we were, all 29 of us, sitting in the block in the Parliament, and every time another speaker condemned the referendum, said the British were stupid, said we should vote again, we collectively, as your Brexit Party representatives, took the view that we've had enough of being insulted, enough of being talked down to, and we stood up and we shouted back as loud as we could. All right, I hope that was the right thing to do. But I saw something last week in Strasbourg that was disturbing. And it was the sight of Messrs. Juncker and Barnier actually being quite nice about us. Now, beware of people bearing gifts and all that. The tone was different. No attacks on Boris Johnson. No attacks on Brexit, just regret that we were leaving, and talk of changing that desperate, awful new European treaty, that worst deal in history that Richard has just talked about, and talk perhaps of the backstop being changed. Mr. Juncker, in his speech, we were there listening, said, "I have no emotional attachment to the backstop." Later on that evening, I've no idea what he'd been doing at lunch, but I can guess. Don't condemn a man for that, you know. But later on that day, he said he had no erotic attachment to the backstop. Which all goes to show you can disagree with people but still find them amusing. You can disagree with people but still like them. That's how civilized democracy ought to work. We ought to respect the fact people have different points of view, provided they're sincerely held. That matters. It matters. We voted Brexit because we wanted to be an independent country. We voted Brexit because we wanted to be a democracy. We voted Brexit because we wanted to be able to choose our own friends and relationships around the rest of the world. And every one of us in this room knows that our relationship with the Commonwealth, America, and the English-speaking world matters more than our relationship with our European neighbours. But we also voted Brexit because we wanted to take back control of our borders. And no county knows this and feels this more keenly than Kent. The current farcical situation where anybody being trafficked across the English Channel that puts a foot on a Kent beach or gets brought from this side of the 12-mile line is simply allowed to stay. It is weak government that is forcing us into this. Very weak government that allows this. But the truth is, however shocked we may be about our weakness, the numbers of people coming here by dinghy are frankly, statistically insignificant. Let's remind ourselves that since the end of World War II, when we felt, quite rightly, that we owed a huge debt to those Commonwealth nations who voluntarily, every one of them voluntarily, had come. There was no conscription from any empire country, any Commonwealth country, and yet in those two world wars, and sharing our losses and our sadness, 40% of our entire contribution in those wars came from what are now Commonwealth countries, and we felt rightly that we owed them a debt. And we began a campaign, a program of Commonwealth immigration. And it ran from the late 1940s, and it ran through the 40s, and it ran through the 50s, and it ran through the 60s, and it ran through the 70s, and it ran through the 80s, and it ran nearly towards the end of the 1990s of controlled immigration from the Commonwealth and the rest of the world. And it averaged a net figure of about 30,000 people every year. And there is no question that of all countries in Europe, we were the ones that did immigration the best. We were the ones that managed to get integration of migrant communities in with the existing community the best. We were the ones that had the best levels of tolerance, the best levels of understanding, the best levels of respect, certainly compared to our neighbours across the Channel who always found this difficult. And then Tony Blair got in and decided to open up, decided to rub the noses of the right in diversity. And then the European Union expanded. And we have finished up for much of the last decade, in fact, on average, for all of the last decade, with net migration to this country running at nearly 300,000 people every single year. And that is without those who come and settle illegally. We are not an intolerant country. And believe you me, we are not an intolerant party. But surely, common sense says that when you have a government that is responsible for education, a government that is responsible for healthcare, a government that is responsible for infrastructure, you cannot have a complete open door to limitless numbers of people. You need to control immigration, to do it properly, to do it sensibly. They're terrified of us breaking free. They're terrified of us leaving the single market. They're terrified of us being outside the customs union. They're terrified of us being able to make our own deals with America, Jamaica, or wherever we choose. They're terrified of us getting back our fishing waters. They're terrified of us doing better than they are. They're terrified of us becoming richer and more successful and prouder and happier than they are. And that is the prize of Brexit, and that is why we must not and we will not sell out if Boris decides to go down the route of reheating Mrs. May's deal. We will stand and fight you every inch of the way, Boris, if you make that mistake.